Let me begin by saying something that I think needs to be stated clearly and without any hedging whatsoever, because the events we are discussing today are not merely a matter of municipal politics or local embarrassment for a newly elected mayor. What we are looking at here is something considerably more serious, and I want to walk you through this carefully, layer by layer, because each layer reveals something deeply troubling about the current state of American political culture, American national security, and the extraordinarily complex geopolitical environment in which the United States finds itself operating right now in the Middle East. So let us start at the beginning. Let us start with what actually happened, because before we can understand the significance of this, we need to be absolutely precise about the facts as we know them. The Mayor's Office of New York City, specifically the Office of the International Affairs Commissioner appointed by Mayor Zohran Mamdani, made arrangements, actual scheduled arrangements, to meet with Iran's United Nations ambassador. Now, on the surface, one might argue that New York City, as a global metropolis, as arguably the most internationally connected city on the planet, has legitimate reasons to maintain diplomatic channels with foreign representatives who are stationed at the United Nations. That argument, on its surface, carries a degree of superficial plausibility, but here is where that argument collapses entirely, and I want you to understand precisely why it collapses. The timing of this proposed meeting was not incidental, it was not coincidental. The meeting was scheduled to take place in the immediate aftermath of Iranian forces firing ballistic missiles at two commercial vessels traversing the Strait of Hormuz. Now, the Strait of Hormuz, for those who need a brief geographical and strategic reminder, is one of the most critically important maritime choke points on the entire planet. Approximately 20% of the world's oil supply passes through that narrow stretch of water. It connects the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman, and by extension to the broader Indian Ocean. When any actor, state or non-state, fires upon commercial shipping in that waterway, they are not merely committing an act of localized aggression, they are threatening the economic stability of the entire international system. They are threatening the energy security of America's allies in Europe and Asia. They are, in the most literal sense of the phrase, attacking the foundations of the international order that the United States has spent the better part of 8 decades constructing and defending. And what makes this particular incident even more alarming is the context in which it occurred. These Iranian missile strikes on commercial shipping happened in what the reporting describes as direct defiance of an interim peace agreement between the United States and Iran. Think about what that means for a moment. There was a diplomatic framework in place. There was an agreement, however fragile, however preliminary, designed to de-escalate tensions between Washington and Tehran. And Iran, in what can only be described as a deliberate and calculated act of provocation, chose that precise moment to fire missiles at commercial vessels. This was not an accident. This was not a miscalculation by some rogue commander operating without authorization from Tehran. This was a signal. This was Iran communicating in the language that authoritarian regimes speak most fluently, which is the language of force and intimidation, that they will not be constrained by diplomatic agreements when they judge that aggression serves their strategic interests. And it is against that backdrop, that extraordinarily tense and dangerous backdrop, that New York City's International Affairs Commissioner thought it appropriate to schedule a meeting with Iran's United Nations representative. I have been studying international security and geopolitics for the better part of 4 decades. I have watched governments make poor decisions. I have watched officials demonstrate extraordinary lapses in judgment. But I must confess that the sheer audacity of the timing here takes one's breath away. It is the kind of decision that, if it had been made by a junior diplomat in a foreign ministry, would have ended that person's career before the week was out. Now, Mayor Mamdani's response to this, when he was pressed at a news conference, is itself worthy of very careful examination, because the way in which political leaders respond to crises of their own making tells us a great deal about their character, their competence, and their understanding of the responsibilities they carry. The mayor stated, And I want to be precise about this because the exact wording matters enormously, that the meeting did not take place, that it will not take place, and crucially, that he did not know about it until there was a press inquiry regarding it. Let us sit with that last statement for a moment, because it deserves considerably more scrutiny than it has thus far received in the public discourse. The mayor of New York City did not know that his own International Affairs Commissioner, the individual whose entire professional mandate is to manage the city's relationships with foreign governments and international organizations, was planning to meet with the representative of a government that is currently, at this very moment, firing missiles at commercial shipping, that has repeatedly and publicly vowed to assassinate the sitting President of the United States, and that has been designated by successive American administrations as the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism. The mayor did not know. Now, there are precisely two explanations for that statement, and neither of them reflects well on the Mamdani administration. Either the mayor genuinely did not know, in which case we have a catastrophic failure of internal communication and oversight within City Hall, a failure so profound that it raises serious questions about whether this administration has the basic administrative competence required to govern a city of 8 million people. Or the mayor did know and is now engaged in what can only be described as a straightforward act of political dishonesty, distancing himself from a decision that has generated significant negative press coverage. I will leave it to you to assess which of those two explanations strikes you as more plausible, but I would suggest that neither explanation should give New Yorkers, or indeed Americans more broadly, any particular comfort. What makes this situation even more revealing is the reporting from the City Journal, which apparently obtained internal communications from the Commissioner's office, indicating that the explicit instruction given to staff was to prioritize meetings with foreign leaders who are in, and I am quoting directly here, political alignment/leftist orientation. Now, this is an extraordinary document. This is an internal directive from a city government official instructing staff to conduct the city's international engagements on the basis of ideological compatibility rather than on the basis of the city's actual interests, or, more importantly, on the basis of American national security considerations. Think about the implications of that for a moment. The city of New York, which houses the United Nations headquarters, which is home to the largest and most diverse diplomatic community in the Western Hemisphere, was apparently being directed to filter its international engagements through an ideological lens. And the Iranian regime, a theocratic, authoritarian government that executes political dissidents, that imprisons women for the crime of not wearing a headscarf, that funds proxy militias across the Middle East, that fires missiles at civilian shipping, was apparently considered to meet the threshold of political alignment with the progressive administration of Mayor Mamdani. This brings me to a point that I think is absolutely fundamental to understanding what we are actually dealing with here, and it is a point that I want to make with some care because I think it is often obscured by the heat of partisan political debate. There exists, within certain segments of the American left, a profoundly confused and, I would argue, deeply dangerous worldview in which opposition to American foreign policy, opposition to Israel, and sympathy for governments and movements that position themselves as anti-imperialist becomes a kind of political identity. And within that worldview, the Iranian regime, despite its record of brutal domestic repression, despite its systematic persecution of women and religious minorities, despite its explicit genocidal rhetoric directed at Israel and its ongoing threats against American officials, gets recategorized, gets mentally repositioned as a fellow traveler in the struggle against American hegemony. And that recategorization, that profound moral confusion, is not merely an academic or philosophical problem when it finds expression in the actual decision-making of a government official, when it results in a scheduled meeting between a city commissioner and the representative of a government that is actively threatening American lives. It becomes a national security problem. And let us now turn to the dimension of this story that is, in many ways, the most alarming of all, because the Iran-New York City controversy does not exist in isolation. It exists within a broader context of Iranian threat activity against the United States that is genuinely and soberly frightening. The Wall Street Journal reporting that Israel has warned the United States about Iranian plans to assassinate President Trump is not, I want to be very clear about this, a piece of political theater. This is not hyperbole. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has maintained an active and ongoing campaign of assassination plots against American officials for years. General Qasem Soleimani, who was killed by American forces in January of 2020, was himself the architect of numerous plots against American personnel across the Middle East. His death did not end those ambitions. If anything, the Iranian leadership has made abundantly clear, repeatedly and publicly, that retaliation for Soleimani's killing remains a stated objective of the Islamic Republic. President Trump himself acknowledged this at a level of personal candor that is quite striking when you actually listen to what he said. He stated that he is on every Iranian list, every single one of their lists, and expressed what sounded like genuine uncertainty about how long his luck would hold. And then he went further, stating that he has left instructions that if anything happens to him, Iran should be bombed at levels they have never seen before. Now, regardless of where one stands politically on the question of Donald Trump, that statement, taken in its full context, is a window into just how serious the American intelligence community's assessment of the Iranian assassination threat actually is. Presidents do not make statements like that casually. Presidents do not instruct their successors to launch retaliatory strikes unless the threat environment that has been presented to them by their intelligence services justifies that level of contingency planning. So we have, in the space of a single news cycle, the following convergence of events. Iranian forces firing missiles at commercial shipping in defiance of a peace agreement. Israeli intelligence warning Washington of active Iranian assassination plots against the American president, and the International Affairs Commissioner of the Mayor of New York City scheduling a meeting with Iran's United Nations ambassador. These events are not separate stories. They are different facets of the same fundamental problem, which is the question of how seriously American institutions, at every level of government, take the threat posed by the Islamic Republic of Iran. Now, I want to pick up precisely where we left off, because I think there is a thread running through everything we have discussed so far that has not yet been pulled on sufficiently, and pulling on that thread reveals something that goes considerably deeper than the immediate controversy surrounding Mayor Mamdani's office. What we are really talking about, when we strip away the noise of the daily news cycle and the partisan point scoring that inevitably accompanies stories like this one, is a fundamental question about institutional integrity. It is a question about whether American institutions, at the federal level, at the state level, and yes, at the municipal level, have developed the kind of internal cultures and the kind of oversight mechanisms necessary to prevent ideological capture from translating into decisions that actively compromise national security. And the honest answer to that question, based on the evidence available to us, is that they have not. Not consistently, not reliably, and the consequences of that failure are becoming increasingly visible and increasingly dangerous. Let me develop that point by drawing your attention to something that was raised in the discussion surrounding this story, something that deserves considerably more attention than it typically receives in mainstream media coverage. The reference to Robert Malley, who served as the Biden administration's special envoy for Iran, is not a peripheral detail. It is central to understanding the broader pattern we are examining. Robert Malley had his security clearance suspended and was placed under FBI investigation while serving in one of the most sensitive diplomatic roles in the United States government. His portfolio, his entire professional mandate, was to manage negotiations with the Islamic Republic of Iran on the question of nuclear weapons, arguably the single most consequential national security issue facing the United States in the Middle East. And it emerged that there were serious counterintelligence concerns surrounding his conduct in that role. Now, I am not going to speculate about the specific nature of those concerns, because the investigation remains, to the best of my knowledge, unresolved in terms of its public conclusions. But the fact that an individual in that position, with that level of access to America's most sensitive diplomatic strategies, could have his clearance suspended on counterintelligence grounds is a profoundly serious matter that deserved far more sustained public scrutiny than it received. And then there is the Iran Experts Initiative, which is the other piece of this puzzle that I think is absolutely critical to understanding the full picture. The Iran Experts Initiative, for those who may not be familiar with it, was essentially a coordinated effort in which Iranian government officials were communicating with and, according to the reporting based on leaked emails, actively coordinating with academics, policy analysts, and individuals connected to Western governments, with the explicit purpose of shaping public opinion and policy debate in the United States and across the Western world in directions favorable to the Iranian regime. Now, when you hear that described in those terms, what you are actually describing is a classic influence operation. This is not a novel tactic. This is something that sophisticated state actors have been doing for decades. The Soviet Union was extraordinarily good at it during the Cold War. China has developed it into something approaching an art form in the contemporary era. And Iran, which is a considerably more sophisticated adversary than it is often given credit for being in Western popular discourse, has clearly invested heavily in developing its own capacity to conduct these kinds of soft power influence campaigns. The reason this matters so directly to the Mamdani controversy is this. When you have a political environment in which Iranian influence operations have succeeded in cultivating sympathetic networks within American academic and policy communities, when you have officials like Robert Malley, whose relationship with Iranian interlocutors raised serious enough counterintelligence flags to warrant FBI investigation, and when you then have a newly elected mayor of the largest city in the United States whose International Affairs Commissioner is directing staff to seek meetings with Iranian officials on the basis of ideological alignment, you are not looking at a series of isolated and unconnected incidents. You are looking at what intelligence professionals would describe as a pattern, and patterns in the world of national security and counterintelligence are never accidental. Patterns are meaningful. Patterns tell you something about the strategic intentions of the actor who is generating them. Now, I want to be very precise here because I think precision is absolutely essential when we are discussing matters that touch on counterintelligence and foreign influence, and I do not want to overstate what the evidence currently supports. I am not suggesting that Mayor Mamdani is an Iranian agent. I am not suggesting that his commissioner was acting at the direction of Tehran. What I am suggesting, and what I think the evidence clearly supports, is that the ideological environment that the Mamdani administration has created within City Hall is one that is sufficiently sympathetic to anti-American and anti-Israel narratives that it creates genuine vulnerability. It creates a permissive environment in which Iranian diplomatic representatives can reasonably calculate that an approach to New York City officials might be welcomed rather than rebuffed. And from the perspective of Iranian strategic planning, that kind of permissive environment is extraordinarily valuable. You do not need to recruit an agent if you can simply identify officials whose ideological predispositions make them naturally inclined to take your meetings, to listen to your arguments, and to advocate, however unconsciously, for positions that serve your interests. This brings me to a point about the Iranian strategic posture more broadly, because I think it is important to understand that everything Tehran does, whether it is firing missiles at commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz, whether it is maintaining assassination plots against American officials, or whether it is cultivating relationships with sympathetic political figures in Western cities, is part of a coherent, long-term strategic framework. Iran is not a reckless actor. I know that it is sometimes portrayed that way, particularly in American media coverage that tends to focus on the most inflammatory statements from Iranian leaders and the most dramatic incidents of Iranian-sponsored violence. But beneath the rhetoric and beneath the violence, there is a sophisticated strategic logic at work. And understanding that logic is essential if you want to understand why the events we have been discussing today are as serious as they are. Iran's fundamental strategic objective, the objective that has animated its foreign policy since the Islamic Revolution of 1979, is the survival and consolidation of the Islamic Republic as a regional hegemon in the Middle East. Everything else, the nuclear program, the proxy networks in Lebanon and Iraq and Yemen and Gaza, the assassination plots against foreign officials, the missile attacks on commercial shipping, everything flows from that central objective. The Iranian leadership calculates, with a degree of strategic coherence that Western analysts sometimes underestimate, that the primary obstacles to achieving regional hegemony are the United States' military presence in the Middle East and the existence of Israel as a militarily capable regional power. Remove or sufficiently degrade those two obstacles, the thinking goes, and the path to Iranian regional dominance becomes considerably clearer. Let me bring this analysis to a conclusion by stepping back and offering what I think is the most important observation to be drawn from the totality of what we have discussed today. We are living through a period of extraordinary geopolitical flux. The international order that the United States built after the Second World War, the order based on open trade, freedom of navigation, collective security, and the peaceful resolution of disputes, is under sustained challenge from multiple directions simultaneously. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, China's increasingly assertive posture in the Indo-Pacific, and Iran's relentless campaign to destabilize the Middle East and undermine American influence in the region. Meeting these challenges requires not only military strength, not only diplomatic skill, but also a level of domestic political coherence, a shared understanding of American interests and American values that makes it possible to present a credible and unified front to adversaries who are actively looking for divisions to exploit. What the Mamdani affair reveals, in microcosm, is the degree to which that domestic political coherence is fraying. When the mayor of the largest city in the United States appoints an international affairs commissioner who instructs staff to seek ideological alignment with foreign governments rather than to advance American interests, when that commissioner schedules meetings with representatives of a government that is firing missiles at commercial shipping and plotting to assassinate the American president, and when the mayor's response to the exposure of this is to claim ignorance and promise new processes for approving meeting requests, something has gone seriously wrong. Not just in New York City, but in the broader political culture that made it possible for someone with Mayor Mamdani's apparent worldview to be elected to govern 8 million Americans in the first place. The Iranian regime is watching all of this very carefully. Do not doubt that for a single moment. Iranian intelligence services are sophisticated. Their analysts are well educated, many of them in Western universities. They understand American domestic politics with considerable nuance. And what they see when they look at stories like this one is not merely a municipal embarrassment for a rookie mayor. What they see is an opportunity to probe, to test, to cultivate, and ultimately to exploit the divisions within American society for their own strategic advantage. That is what sophisticated adversaries do, and the most effective response to that kind of strategic exploitation is not simply better security procedures in the New York City mayor's office, though those would certainly be welcome. The most effective response is clarity. Clarity about American values, clarity about American interests, and clarity about the nature of the Iranian regime and the threat it poses to both. That clarity, I am sorry to say, was conspicuously absent from the Mamdani administration's approach to international affairs, and its absence has consequences that extend far beyond the borders of New York City.